When I was first pitched on reading the Wheel of Time series by a mysterious stranger I met at a social event in Berlin one time, whose name I can't recall and who I never encountered again, he described it like this. It's a 14-book series, and each book is 800 pages long, and the last book is all one massive battle scene. Now back then, the only fantasy series I had ever really read was The Lord of the Rings, and so that blew my mind. I thought Lord of the Rings was a pretty long book series, but oh boy was I wrong, apparently. And the sheer brazenness of the concept of having an 800-page book that was all just one massive final battle, that intrigued me. And as I finally picked up the Wheel of Time and started to read through it, what kept me going in a lot of ways through the series was the anticipation of this epic finale. I was expecting this last book to blow my mind and knock all expectations out of the water. And I think that's the same for a lot of people who read it, possibly even more so. Because unlike me, most people who read A Memory of Light, the last Wheel of Time book when it first came out, were waiting for it for over 20 years, which is hard for me to believe. So all of that is to say that there was a lot writing on this last book, and unsurprisingly, some people have conflicted opinions about it. To be clear, I think the majority of opinions are extraordinarily positive. I think the majority of fans think that Brandon Sanderson did a great job with finishing the series. But nonetheless, if you go on Amazon and look at a lot of the top-rated reviews, it's pretty easy to find reviews that are negative or at most a little bit wishy-washy. One of the things that I think is surprising about the ending of this series is that there is not, as I expected there to be when I first started reading it, a Lord of the Rings style wrap-up where we follow the characters for years after the main events of the series, after the final battle, and see them return to their normal lives and tie everything up with a bow, and just spend, you know, at least a good 200 pages or so in an epilogue, because it's such a ridiculously long series. Surely it would have like an extended conclusion. But A Memory of Light doesn't do that. The structure of the book is basically one massive Sander Lanch, so to speak. Although in this case it would be a Sander Jordan Lanch or something. The tension just continues to build and build and build and build almost until the very last page. And when I was reading the book for the first time, there was a certain point near the end where I was starting to get worried because I thought there's no way this is going to have a satisfying conclusion. And yet nonetheless, here I am making a video on why I think the ending of The Wheel of Time is basically perfect, or at least as perfect as it could be. And I want to explain why that is. Now, unfortunately, this is about as far as I can go without giving massive spoilers. So if you have not read The Wheel of Time and are at all interested in reading it at any point in the future, please don't watch the rest of this video. I'm really sorry. I know there's a huge barrier to entry to watching this because it's a 14-book long series, so I don't know how well this video is going to do. But whatever. What I'll say now is that if your major crux about deciding whether or not to read the series is whether the ending will be good, I'd say go into it. I think the ending is great. Anyway, huge spoilers after the intro. This is your last warning. Bye. See you later. A quick disclaimer. When I say I'm talking about the ending of The Wheel of Time in this video, what I'm mainly talking about is the last 100 pages or so of A Memory of Light. If we're talking about the final book as a whole, then I think there are some genuine criticisms that you can make. Like, for example, I think that Tarmon Gaidon should have featured more examples of insane channeling, because throughout the entire series we've had these scenes like Dumai's Wells and the Battle of Meridon where there are just these massive feats of incredible power. And yet, at Tarmon Gaidon, the generals just deploy basically the same pre-modern military tactics that we've seen throughout the entire series up until this point. You'd think that having a zillion channelers throwing fireballs and death gates everywhere would change up the dynamic a little bit, but that's not really the case. Regardless though, that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about in this video is specifically the very, very ending of the series, the way the entire story gets wrapped up. Alright, so just in case it's been a while since you've read the book, here's a recap of the most important points I'm going to be talking about the ending. As the last battle is going on, Rand has a chat with the Dark One and Shael Ghul, in which both of them create manifestations from the pattern of what their ideal world would look like, while the other contestant rebuts by describing why that world isn't actually a perfect world. In particular, they're discussing the nature of free will and good and evil. Then, in a moment of despair, Moradin tries to take control of Kalandor, and Rand exploits the flaw in Kalandor by linking with Moraine and Nynaeve in order to control Moradin. When the final seals on the Dark One's prison are broken, Rand then pushes the Dark One out of reality, reseals the prison, and switches bodies with Moradin. Moradin then dies in Rand's body, and Rand, as Moradin, continues to live. But the thing is, everybody thinks that it's Rand who is dead because Moradin is in Rand's body. And so Rand, having a chance to restart his life without anybody knowing that he's still alive, rides off into the sunset, and the only people who know that he's still alive are his 3 wives and Cadsuane. Alright, so that's the ending in a nutshell. I want to start off by talking about this debate that Rand has with the Dark One, because one criticism I've actually seen of this book is people expressing confusion about why the final battle in the Wheel of Time is just a philosophical discussion about the nature of free will. It's easy to say that it feels a bit contrived that these 2 celestial beings would just be having a conversation like this, but it could also be a little confusing because the Wheel of Time is about so many things, so why is the final message we're getting left with at the very conclusion of the series that evil is necessary in order for free will to exist? And sure, the Wheel of Time is about a lot of different things, so honing in on free will, at least I can understand why that might seem a little weird. But at the same time, Rand's entire arc throughout the books is about his struggle with his role in this endless cycle of death and rebirth of which he is a part. And it's out of this struggle that is born his desire to not just re-imprison the Dark One as the Dragon Reborn did in all previous ages, but to kill him, to break the wheel essentially, to stop this endless cycle. And so it's wonderfully ironic when he finally discovers that doing this is going to erode what last shred of free will he actually does have, and that in order to make decisions for himself, in order to have free will, he needs to allow the Dark One to continue to live. Even though it's made pretty clear, I think, that he could have killed him if he wanted to. The reason I think this is so perfect is because even though in many ways the Wheel of Time takes place in a world that is very alien to ours, a world in which the laws of entropy as we know them don't exist, in which time, rather than being linear, is this constant cycle that just never stops, and in which there really is no peace, because we always know that after death we're just going to get reborn again and again and again a million times. But at the same time, even though the laws of physics in the world of the Wheel of Time are very different from in our own, we sort of see in this idea of an endlessly turning wheel a reflection of how there really is no endpoint to history. There isn't just going to be a time in the future where things stop. Even after we're dead, the world is just going to continue spinning and people are just going to continue to do stuff. And as much as we like to dream of achieving a perfect utopia, the very nature of the laws of physics, really, not just human nature, make it impossible to do so. So long as people have the ability to make decisions for themselves, there are always going to be people who make decisions that are harmful to other people. And this is something that's really hard to accept and kind of a downer, but I think the Wheel of Time does a really good job of grappling with this problem. And Rand's final acceptance that he's never going to be able to make a perfect world is, I think, maybe a little bit comforting. So moving on, one of the other things I was talking about earlier is just how very brief the epilogue to A Memory of Light is. For most of the characters, there really isn't much there in terms of conclusion. Perrin gets a little bit, and Matt gets a little bit, and Nynaeve gets a little bit, but for the most part, the focus of this epilogue isn't really on them. The focus is on Rand. And that can be a little bit frustrating because you've spent 14 books with these characters, you want to get to see the endings of their story, and you don't really get to see it. And to make matters worse, a lot of what this epilogue seems to be doing is setting up potential sequels. For those who don't know, Matt was originally going to have a sequel series set in Shanshan that follows his exploits with his new wife and Shanshan, but obviously that never got written, and Brandon Sanderson says that he is almost certainly never going to write it. In fact, he's pretty adamant about not wanting to write it. And so if that's the case, what's going on here? Why are we just setting up future story arcs and character arcs that we're never going to get to see? I think the reason I'm okay with leaving open a lot of cliffhangers in the epilogue is because I really like stories that don't wrap everything up, that keep you thinking about them for years after finishing them. The Wheel of Time, as I've been saying, is about a world that's constantly changing, that's always in motion, and so it would feel wrong to just imply at the ending of the series that characters have basically just stopped growing, that things have stopped developing. We get all this stuff about Matt finding out that he's going to be a father and Cadsuane becoming the new Amerlin seat, and You know, we don't really know what's going to become of that, but that's okay. We can imagine. And that leads me directly into another thing that I love so much about this ending, which is the fact that it raises so many more questions than it answers. How did Rand light the pipe? Who is Nakomi? Are the Aiel still going to be hunted into extinction by the Shan-Chan after being included in the Dragon's Peace? What did Arthur Hawkwing say to Tuon? And most importantly of all, perhaps, what's going to happen if Moghedien happens to see Rand in Moradin's body years later and thinks that he's Moradin? That would be awkward. Can we get that scene, please? That would be cool. I think the most powerful endings are always like this. The endings that stick with me are usually endings that pose some final question or make you look at everything you've seen before in a new light. Oftentimes in movies, this takes the form of a single mysterious shot that sort of gets your brain churning. And in The Wheel of Time, I think that this shot is the scene where Rand lights the pipe. What's going on there? Who's to say? It's almost like Robert Jordan is winking at you from beyond the grave when you read that passage. I think it's really a testament to the power of this ending that 10 years on, we still are so engaged with the story that recently, when Brandon Sanderson finally revealed a secret about the ending of this book that he had been teasing for literally a decade, people were still engaged and interested in it and surprised by it, which is really cool. And for those of you who are not aware, the secret is that Lanfear actually faked her death in the final chapter of this book. And so Lanfear is still out there, yet another loose end that's not going to be tied up, ever. But I think perhaps what I like most about the ending of The Wheel of Time is just how bittersweet it is. I think every good story needs to have a little bit of bitterness and a little bit of sweetness in the ending, and boy, does this book deliver. On the one hand, almost everybody Rand ever knew thinks that he is dead, including his own father, which sucks and is really sad. But on the other hand, now that everybody thinks he's dead, he gets a chance to live the life that he never got to live, which is awesome. And in the hands of a less talented author, this sort of resolution would feel a lot like having your cake and eating it too, but that's not what this feels like to me. Instead, it feels like the perfect thematic conclusion to everything that's been going on in the story. It certainly helps that it was very well foreshadowed, but also I think it's the perfect conclusion because Rand's entire story is about him struggling with his identity as the Dragon Reborn. You know, you have Farmer Rand and you have Dragon Reborn Rand, and it's almost like they're two separate people, with Lews Therin, this voice in his head, sort of embodying the Dragon Reborn aspect of himself. And so it makes total sense that when he finally fulfills his mission, he is able to not only spiritually but physically separate these two halves of himself and escape from the Dragon Reborn half of himself to just be the farmer half of himself. I think that's a really cool literal way of expressing the ultimate culmination of his whole journey. And I also really love that at the very end, the only person other than Rand's wives who knows that he's still alive is Cadsuane. I've seen some people say it should have been Moraine, but honestly, it's such a Cadsuane thing to just look at him and know what's up immediately that I don't know, I love it. I think it's perfect and a little bit ironic and humorous, which a little bit of humor is definitely something that this epilogue needed. So yeah, this perfect balance of the bitterness and the sweetness is really what made this one of the most powerful endings to a book I've ever read, and yeah, I think it was the hardest I've ever cried while reading a book. It's a lot, you know, there's not really anything like it. The sheer weight of all the time you've invested in this series is just like hanging over your head as you're reading this final book, and I think that alone made the series worth reading, because you couldn't have accomplished the same feat of becoming emotionally attached to these characters in the same way if the series had been much shorter than it was. So in conclusion, A Memory of Light is great. It's about as perfect a book as it could possibly have been, in my opinion, but feel free to let me know what you thought of this book in the comments. And also, I will probably do a review of Season 2 of the TV show at some point. I still have to watch the episodes that have come out. I haven't gotten around to it. I've been very busy. Anyway, do consider subscribing and checking out my other videos if you enjoyed this. I talk a lot about The Wheel of Time and the Cosmere and lots of other fantasy and sci-fi books. Thank you so much for watching, and may you always find water and shade.